Shana Tova. I'm so honored to be with you on these high holidays. As we look forward during this season of renewal, this is a particularly powerful moment of reflection for American Jews. We've had much opportunity in America. Throughout our history, we've prospered in many places, but our history teaches us that prosperity is easily taken away. For every land where we've prospered, we've been confronted with intolerance, hatred, and violence. We've learned over countless generations that even in the best of times, we must always be vigilant in our stand against injustice. We've learned that our fate is tied to the fate of all oppressed people. For once hatred spreads against any otherized population, all otherized populations are threatened. We know what it means to be the other. And so, as we watch the oppression of Black Americans, we're reminded that this is our fight too. We're shaken to hear the brutality levied against Black lives. Names like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks are etched in our consciousness. But while these highly publicized killings by law enforcement officers might be the most visible violence against Black lives, they don't represent the only violence we should be concerned with. You see, for every person killed by police, tens of thousands survive police encounters and are thrown into a criminal justice system reserved almost exclusively for the poor, disproportionately for Black and brown people. There's a routine violence, an invisible violence, a violence not captured on cell phone footage that happens in our criminal legal system every day. It fuels mass incarceration. 2.3 million bodies in cages, twice that number under correctional control. Our most vulnerable communities lose their ability to work, to vote, to get educational loans, to benefit from affordable housing. Communities, families, children are crippled by a system of justice that punishes because of who you are and where you're from, rather than what you did wrong. And as Jews, we understand this all too well. Ours is a history that has taught us of oppression, of intolerance, of hatred. We've been demonized and vilified across the globe. We were enslaved in Egypt. We were victims of mass genocide during the Holocaust. In between, we've known inquisitions, mass expulsions, pogroms. As a people, we've learned that this history carries with it an obligation to stand up, to be present, to resist, wherever there's intolerance. One of my earliest memories of being aware that I was Jewish was when my father taught me the concept of tikkun olam as a child. It's the obligation to help repair the world. As Jews, we're called upon to leave this world better than we found it. The concept of tikkun olam has guided every aspect of my life. I chose a life's partner, Ilham Askia, who's dedicated to service. Together we founded Gideon's Promise, an organization that's building a movement of public defenders to humanize an otherwise cruel and inhumane criminal legal system. But nowhere has the concept of tikkun olam guided me more than in how I raise my children. My children understand the connection between America's history of racial oppression and the Jewish experience as a despised people. You see, Aliyah and Lucas are Jewish, but they're also Black. They live it every day. When Ilham, who I call Illy, and I got married, my best friend Andrew gave us the most precious wedding gift. He made us a Haggadah that weaves together the Jewish story of the Exodus with the African-American experience with slavery. So each year at Passover, our children reflect on the common history of their two families, of Blacks and of Jews. They understand that in America, our futures are inextricably bound together. The Haggadah was meant to be a living document, to be updated with current events. Several years ago, I added a story I learned while watching a documentary called The Jewish Americans. It documented the Jewish experience in this country. And there was a section that discussed the disproportionate representation of Jews among whites who came to the South to join courageous Black civil rights freedom fighters in the 1960s. One story was told by the inspirational late Rabbi Rachel Cowan. She's known to many as the mother of Jewish healing. She embodied the concept of tikkun olam. In this documentary, Rabbi Cowan told a story of Freedom Summer. That summer in 1964, when young people from across the country joined black civil rights activists in Mississippi to register people to vote. Rabbi Cowan was a young activist at the time in Oxford, Ohio, training to go to Mississippi, when the news came of the disappearance of 3 young civil rights workers. James Chaney, a black Mississippian, and Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, 2 Jewish Americans from New York. It would soon become clear that they were murdered. Rabbi Cowan recalls the leaders telling the young students that they didn't need to get on the bus to Mississippi the next morning, that the leaders couldn't protect them, and the students were terrified. Rabbi Cowan then relays a conversation she overheard where a young woman was talking to her mother on the phone. The mother was clearly urging the young woman not to get on that bus. The young woman then said, "Mother, if more Germans had just stood up, maybe it would have prevented the Holocaust." But we don't just teach this obligation to our children, we want them to live it. Gideon's Promise is a modern-day civil rights movement of young public defenders fighting to resist injustice in criminal legal systems all across the country. They certainly are engaged in the fight for Black lives, but more generally, they're engaged in the fight to ensure every person is treated with dignity and humanity. These are quintessentially Jewish values. We bring the community together every 6 months for training, community building, support, and inspiration. And my children have never missed a gathering. They were born into it. These freedom fighters are their role models. Right? From these freedom fighters, from these public defenders, our children learn tikkun olam. Our children understand we bring them every 6 months because they're Black. They understand we bring them every 6 months because they're Jewish, and they understand we bring them every 6 months because they're human. My children understand that these 3 things cannot be separated. On October 27, 2018, Robert Bowers killed 11 Jewish worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in a Pittsburgh neighborhood called Squirrel Hill. Squirrel Hill is my home. I grew up there. I was bar mitzvahed at the Tree of Life. I recall a story I read a couple days later about a doctor named Jeffrey Cohen. He was the president of Allegheny General Hospital, where Robert Bowers was treated after the massacre. The Tree of Life was Dr. Cohen's synagogue. It was his community. And in the story, Dr. Cohen visited Robert Bowers as he laid in the hospital. I recall how he treated Mr. Bowers with compassion. His job was to heal. I thought of this story again when I learned that Jacob Blake laid handcuffed to his hospital bed like an animal after being shot in the back 7 times while unarmed by police in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The world needs more Dr. Cohens. Civil rights lawyer Brian Stevenson teaches that we are more than the worst thing we've ever done. Dr. Cohen chose to see the humanity in Robert Bowers. In fact, I remember Dr. Cohen's words from the story. He said, "He's a guy. He's not the face of evil. He was a baby once. He was a toddler once. And people were looking at him with all the hope in the world." Dr. Cohen certainly didn't excuse Mr. Bowers' behavior, but he did go on to say, here's someone all alone, and all he hears is the noise in his head all the time. I remember Illy and I talking to our children as they tried to make sense of this tragedy. We discussed the connection between the shooting at the Tree of Life and the killing of 9 Black worshipers participating in Bible study at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, 3 years earlier. We discussed its relationship to the mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub 2 years earlier, leaving 49 people dead and more than 50 injured. It was targeted because it catered to Orlando, Florida's gay community. These massacres are all symptoms of the same disease, rhetoric from leaders who seek to otherize, who seek to divide into categories of us and them. As Jews, we must never forget that we've always been refugees, that we've not always been welcomed. In 1939, the MS St. Louis, a ship carrying over 900 Jews fleeing Nazism, sought refuge in America, and it was refused. It returned to Europe, leaving the passengers to find shelter elsewhere. And it's estimated that roughly a quarter of those passengers perished in death camps during World War II. It's a reminder that any history of oppression is tied to Jewish history. We can't talk about Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman without talking about James Chaney. We can't talk about Leo Frank without talking about Emmett Till. We can't talk about the MS St. Louis without talking about the caging of brown children at the southern border. I think of Pastor Martin Niemöller. He was a Holocaust survivor whose famous words are enshrined at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. It is a lesson that we must always resist demonizing others. I understand that because my daughter is Black, she'll likely know what it's like to be watched when she browses in a department store while her white counterparts are left alone. And I understand that because my son is Black, he'll likely know what it's like to be detained and searched for minor traffic violations for which his white friends get a pass. I understand that because my children are Black, they're going to grow up with the presumption of guilt, the presumption of dangerousness, the presumption of inferiority. But I also understand that because they are Jewish, they understand this oppression is connected to anti-Semitism, to ableism, to xenophobia, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia. Because they're Jewish, they understand they're called upon to stand up not just for Jews, but for anyone treated unfairly. Because they are Jewish, they understand that until everyone is treated with dignity, they are not safe. We understand oppression because we are Jewish. We're obligated to resist oppression because we are Jewish. During these days of awe, as we plan for the future, we also reflect. Our history commands that wherever there's intolerance, we must act. Wherever there's oppression, it's a moment that tests our commitment to who we're called upon to be as a people. Today, in America, this is our moment. I want to end by saying, here's to a sweet year of hope, a sweet year of happiness, and a sweet year of justice. Shana Tova Umetka.